All right. Well, welcome to Roots of Reality Experiences. I'm joined by Dr. Rana Dajani, who is a professor of molecular biology at Hashemite University in Jordan. Additionally, Dr. Dajani is the president of the Society for the Advancement of Science and Technology in the Arab World, as well as the founder of the nonprofit organization We Love Reading, which promotes reading to children around the world. Lastly, she is also the author of various articles and the book Five Scarves Doing the Impossible. If we can reverse self-hate, why can't we redefine success? So, Dr. Tajani, thanks for coming on today.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
So, when did you first get interested in science?
So I grew up in a household where we didn't have a TV and we were avid readers. We subscribed to National Geographic and Scientific American and we read a lot of novels. And we would have late night discussions with my parents. My father was a physician slash scientist, so we would spend hours reflecting on latest discoveries in biology, immunology, and astronomy and physics. And my mother was she ran our household like a school. So we would have responsibilities and roles that made us more disciplinary. And so everybody was in bed at 7, and I would stay up till midnight reading because I loved it so much. So I think the combination of all of that allowed my imagination to explode, and I wanted to be a discoverer, to discover the next frontier. But I couldn't travel, and I think so. All that energy and that aspiration led me to be a pioneer at the level of a cell, to discover things within a cell and molecules and how they interact together. So that's what led me to science, that fascination of nature.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's a human curiosity that everyone kind of has, I guess. Yeah. And so when did you think oh, okay, I'm going to become a biologist?
So at first I was planned to be a physician. My father was a physician and I'm the eldest. And when you're good at school, the expectation is you're going to be a physician. So I enrolled in the first year at the university, but then in the middle of it, I realized that I was scared to make a mistake with a human being if I became a physician. And I thought so I thought I'd rather do experiments and research. That way I would still help humanity because I would be the one who discovers, how cells work and how disease comes and how to prevent it. But I would sleep because I was only working with mice and cells and Petri dishes, which I could live with. and that's what kind of put me on that path of research. And it also satiated my curiosity of discovery. So that's when I decided that I'm just going to be a scientist. And it took me a long time, right? I finished my bachelor's and master's, and there were no PhD programs in Jordan. And although I got accepted at Cambridge in England, I couldn't go because of financial reasons. So I became a school teacher for 10 years until there was a Fulbright announcement in the newspaper, and my husband told me to apply, and I applied, and I got the scholarship. So I went and did my PhD when I was 30. But that's a testimonial to when you want something and have a passion for it, you will achieve it, even if not at the time that you thought you would, or not the path that you thought you would take. But in the end, you would reach it.
Yeah, that's a pretty inspiring background. Just shows you just kind of keep going until you get there. So that's very cool. And so when did you get interested in thinking about connecting, Islam and evolution?
So I grew up as a Muslim, and my family are practicing Muslims.
Right.
But again, all those evening discussions were stemming from our understanding of Islam as a religion, which in our understanding, it's about fostering curiosity. It's about using your mind. It's about asking questions, that there's no red line. There's no question that's not allowed. On the contrary, as a good practicing Muslim, I have to ask questions and I have to engage. And that's how I was brought up. So that those critical thinking skills were really honed down in my upbringing. And so there was, in my mind, no problem between religion, my religion, Islam, and science. They were a continuum. Science was about using the brain and observation to discover nature. And religion was what set the morals and the ethical values of how to deal with these discoveries, what to do with them to serve humanity in an ethical way.
Yeah, I mean, so that's really interesting. And like in terms of evolution, like how do societies, how do Islamic societies traditionally like view evolution around the world? I mean, is it common to have that balanced, that perspective of being able to connect it and go together, or is there some opposition to that? What's it like?
So I think to answer that question, one has to, go back to history, right?
Yeah.
So if we go back to the history of the Islamic civilization in the past 1,000 years, it was the golden era of scientific discoveries in every discipline, whether physics or biology or medicine, or plants or even sociology. All the, let's say, the basics of all these disciplines were set by Islamic scholars within the Islamic civilization, and not necessarily being Muslim, but they were
Right.
all part of that civilization: Christian, Jews, Muslims, all working together, but adopting the ethos of the Islamic culture, which is about using your mind, pursuing scientific discovery. Now, so that was the history. And if we go look, how about evolution or studying of organisms and creatures around us? Well, as early as the 7th century, there were scholars who were studying and observing the different kinds of organisms, and trying to understand how related they are just by looking at their morphology. So we have Al-Jahid, we have Ikhwan al-Safa. So, and even Ibn Sina, all these are scholars all throughout the centuries who have written and maybe rudimentary theories that point to some kind of connectiveness, some kind of something similar to evolution, although it didn't mature to the level that Darwin
Right.
posited
Right.
in the 19th century. But they were not opposed. It was just part of science and part of discovery. So that's the history of the Islamic civilization. Now, however, in the last 200 years, with colonialism and lack of, let's say, empires go up and down. So it was the demise of the Ottoman Empire, and therefore there were less and less scholars and scientists in the Islamic part of the world.
Mhm.
And that led to less education. So when Darwin wrote his book, The Origin of the Species, first it took a long time to be translated into Arabic for
Right.
those who speak Arabic to understand it. Although there were some scholars who actually, in what is now Lebanon, Ibn al-Jisr, who studied Darwin in the late 19th century, right after he was
Oh,
published.
wow.
And
Okay.
they had no problem with Darwin. They took it, they analyzed it, there was no problem. Simultaneous, when the American University of Beirut in Lebanon actually kicked out a scientist from the US who supported evolution, because the American University of Beirut then was a Christian mission.
Huh.
So
Okay.
simultaneous, the Islamic scholar was okay with evolution, but the American University of Beirut, which was a Christian missionary, was not okay.
Right.
So I think, yeah, so that tells you that we
Yeah.
had no problem. However, because we didn't have enough scientists, I think this is my, of course, analysis, that
Mhm.
some of the Islamic scholars observed that some of the Christian groups were against what Darwin said. And so I think they said, if the Christians, who are people of the book like the Muslims, thought that whatever Darwin proposed was against religion, and to them they connected it to atheism, then they adopted that Christian view because they didn't have their own scientists to go figure out what this is all about, right?
Mhm.
And they adopted it blindly. But also, what led to even more, let's say, a negative association between evolution and Darwin in our part of the world, the Islamic world, is the association by some of using Darwin's theory as an excuse for colonialism, racism, superiority,
Mhm.
imperialism. This all became associated with Darwin and evolution, unfortunately. Like many discoveries, they are neutral, but people hijack them for their own
Sure.
agenda. And so Darwin was hijacked for that agenda by his own people, right, from the West. And so from our point of view, people didn't have the right education. And to them, they heard what the colonizer preached, that this is part of science, we are a better race, etc. So no wonder they made that association. So the combination of the Christian stand, the colonialism and imperialism and colonization allowed for this negative perception of evolution that is not based on scientific understanding of the theory, but more
Right.
on the political agenda behind it.
Yeah. I
And
mean that.
so,
Yeah.
yeah, sorry, and so that is why there's this negative receiving of evolution and Darwin. But however, when I start teaching to my students and explaining what the science is, and most importantly, clarifying that Darwin and evolution never talk about the origin of life. Evolution explains the process of how the various forms of living organisms came to be, and does not address the actual beginning of life. And the beginning of life could be God, could be nature, could be anything, and we can discuss that separate. And I can see misunderstandings there, but evolution itself has nothing to do with that. And I think that when people understand that, then they realize that there's nothing that is contradicting to Islam or religion by taking Darwin and evolution as a fact to explain how different organisms came to be.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, that's really interesting analysis, because I mean, so much throughout history, whether it's Christian society or Islamic society, it seems like it's been kind of this back and forth where at times people are, very open to discoveries in nature, and other times they kind of close themselves off out of fear it can interrupt their faith. And but it's I think one of the cool things about science is just how many different civilizations from different backgrounds have contributed to this same story, to understanding the world, whether someone's religious or not. That to see all these different people from different backgrounds and different faiths to different nations and ethnic groups contributing to one thing. I mean, it really is a pretty amazing thing when you think about how science can unify everyone. I'm curious. So in Islamic societies today, is there ever any pushback based on just some type of religious principles where people have a different interpretation of evolution, where they feel like, oh, this contradicts, my interpretation of the Quran, or, what's the situation like?
So yes, and to me, the whole misunderstanding between science and Islam, or in particular evolution in Islam, not just science is accepted. It's the particular topic of evolution in Islam is touchy because of ignorance, right? So that's a fundamental and very important to realize and know. Now, once that ignorance is removed, then people are more open and accept evolution. And maybe the reason they refuse it or have a problem with it in the beginning is because in their mind, evolution. Sorry.
No, you're fine.
Because in their mind, evolution may be connected to lack of a presence of a God. That it's, if you believe in evolution, that means you're an atheist. And as I said, when they understand that evolution is not about how life started, it's about how the process, then they say, okay, then we have no problem. Now, the second thing that may cause a contradiction is human evolution, because so that's the second thing. So in concerning human evolution, some people will also pause and say, but wait, there are verses in the Quran that says Adam or humans were created from clay, and that's a literal interpretation of the verses, and that's when we explain that the Quran is the book of God. However, it is interpreted by humans, and the humans who interpret it base their interpretation on the status of knowledge that exists in their lifetime. So in the past, those verses were interpreted in a particular way based on the level of knowledge and science at that time. Today, we've advanced in science. We have all these molecular biology and tools, and we can understand using what the Quran says and how we use our mind to observe nature and deduct the laws of nature. We can take that discovery that humans evolved from other species and other ancestors, and that we are all part of a tree of life, that we're all connected, and to say that this does not contradict the verses, because if I look at the verses, I can find ways to interpret it that does not contradict that, where clay means that everything is made of materials and atoms and the basic elements, but it took a long time until all the different species came to be. But so that's that kind of let's say argument that one can give those who use the literal translation of or interpretation of verses as a basis for rejecting evolution. But even then, I always say, to me, all the books of the religions are guidelines on how I perform and live my life with other fellow human beings. It's about my morals. It's about my ethical values. It's not about the latest scientific theory, right? Because these books are timeless, as humans are timeless in the sense of the universality of our ethics, altruism, caring for others, honesty, compassion, and empathy. These are universal values that we share that have been with us since we evolved as a species. So the books tell us how to conduct our lives with our other fellow humans. And it tells us to use our minds, use our brains to observe nature and make discoveries. And that's it. So I think that the problem here with some people is that they use the Quran as a book of science, or the Holy Book as a book of science, when it's not. It was never intended to be a book of science. It was intended just to point us to observe nature around us, to use our brains, to ask questions, to foster curiosity and critical thinking. And that way we are always discovering new things. And that way there's no contradiction. Maybe today I discover something and then tomorrow it changes and a newer theory comes out. And that's fine. That can keep changing. But the values don't change. The ethics don't change. And I think if we try to use the Holy Book to interpret science, we're not doing a good service to the Holy Book, because science is changing. But the Holy Book does not, because it's about morals and ethics. So to keep those separate, to me, is the right way going forward.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely fascinating. I mean, it seems like basically all religions kind of have that struggle of back and forth, where people are worried about oh, evolution must contradict my faith or something like that, as you were just saying. Yeah, it's so fascinating, because when you think about evolution in general, I mean, especially from a religious perspective, if you're thinking about God's creation, then you would think that this incredibly complex process is just so sophisticated and amazing. The process of evolution leading to human life. I mean, to me, that seems much more interesting and incredible than just like, okay, here's humans, boom. So I think that's just something that I think people should be, more fascinated by. Like, oh wow, look at this process that led to us.
Actually, I couldn't agree with you more. And this has helped a lot of people when I told them evolution brings me closer to my religion, because it's the beauty and elegance of the theory is a testimonial to the most powerful, by creating one simple law, which is evolution, or one simple explanation, because we know biology without evolution doesn't make sense, is enough to explain everything. This unity and diversity and that harmony is a testimonial to a great power, rather than saying every organism is created. To me, that's not elegant or powerful. And when some people hear that understanding evolution brings me closer, they say, oh, we never thought about it that way. And it made people rethink things. So having that engagement, that dialogue, that positive approach, and not just picking a fight for the sake of a fight, but listening to different sides and having an open mind and trying to establish a basis that we all agree upon, and then building on it logically is a way forward to gain, to help people, understand the science and appreciate it without feeling that their religion is compromised.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like throughout history, that's also been the way of many of the major scientists from the Islamic world and the Christian world and everywhere else around the world, where people like studying nature brings them closer to God, because they can understand that creation by observing it. And so yeah, I mean, it's just a pretty cool thing to think about. Now, what has been the reception like to when you're communicating these things? Are there ever like people that study the Quran for a living, like Islamic scholars? They're like, oh, I don't like that interpretation, or what's the reception among the religious community when it comes to like some of the leaders in the religious community?
So it's a diverse response, right? From some who, like I said, have adopted the Christian, for some Christian sects, that approach, and therefore refusing evolution as a whole, to the others who, like me, accept it and have no problem or challenge, and everything in between. Some like accepting all of evolution except for human evolution, saying no, that's a red line. And like, again, everything in between. And there's a lot that recently has been written about this by some, because you need, I think for me, the way forward is to find not just Islamic theology scholars and basic scientists, but to actually have a conversation between them. Because I don't understand the Islamic theology, and the Islamic theologian doesn't understand the science. So it's about sitting together, explaining, each side explains to the other where they're coming from, unpacking everything to create that dialogue and to reach that point of understanding. And to me, regardless, right? For those who stay fast by their decision that they want to reject evolution, I respect them. And because that's part of freedom of thought, right? That we need to respect everyone, regardless of their opinion. Because if I'm going to force them, then I become like those who are oppressing others. So to me, no, I should respect everybody's opinion. And, regardless if people accept evolution or not, they are actually using the fruits of it, whether in their vaccines, the medication they take, or even the food that we eat, right? Because it's all evolved from wild tomatoes and wild thyme and wild some plants in the past that farmers have actually used the theory of evolution without even realizing it to make a better product.
Right.
So we're all using it. So these become then more philosophical discussions amongst the theologians. But the only fear I have is that if this results in young people who want to pursue science and love science to feel that they have to compromise, that they have to give up one or the other. They have to give up their religion or they have to give up science. And that's why I like to engage in these conversations, just to help these young people that, no, it's not a compromise. You can do both. And if you have Islamic scholars who believe otherwise, respect them and say, okay, you have your opinion, I have my opinion. Let's move forward without having any disagreements and respecting each other.
Yeah, I mean, I think that makes sense. I mean, that's kind of the ideal society is where people are allowed to express those different thoughts and opinions. We can all still be together as a society. But also, you make a great point, because like all the talented people that could get turned away from science just because they think there's a contradiction there. It's like, no, you can be loyal to your religious beliefs while at the same time, looking at science and being a part of the scientific community. So that's a cool way of bridging the gap, I think, that all the stuff that you're communicating, it's really, really fascinating. It sounds like it's also a message that I think people can connect with around the world, regardless of their religion too. So pretty neat.
Absolutely. Yeah. And even I tell people, if you encounter something that appears to be contradictory, right? Because we change and things change. First, and I tell them, okay, so I have a set of steps. First, you check the science, right? Because we know science is these are deductions, observations, and conclusions made by humans, and humans err. And not just that, our technology evolved, and so the tools that we use to observe nature will evolve, and we will know next time around, or the next generation, our observations may change, and so we need to double check our science to make sure that it's correct. And also, we need to keep in mind that we are limited in our own biology. And there's a limitation to how much we can observe, our senses, and that's something that we should be humble about. It shouldn't deter us from exploring, but we need to always be aware that we are limited by our biology. We live in a 4-dimensional world, which we cannot escape, although we know in physics there is at least 11 dimensions, right? We can deduce what's happening with equations and abstract theory, but also acknowledge that limitation that we have. So with taking all that into consideration, if we still are sure that this is the best scientific explanation for a phenomena, then we've double checked our science. Then we go and say, okay, so now we go look at the apparent contradiction with the interpretation of a scripture. And if we see that there's a contradiction, we go check that interpretation, right? Because the interpretation is also done by humans, and humans err. Yeah. And that's okay, right? And the beautiful thing about Islam is that we have a saying that when a scholar does a scholarly piece of work and they appear to be correct, they get 2 rewards. And if they turn out to be wrong, they get 1 reward. So either way, it's a win-win. And to me, that is so freeing that you should never be scared. You try, and if it turned out you were wrong next time round or in the next generation, that's okay. The most important thing is your intention, that you tried. This concept is so freeing. And so if there appears to be a contradiction, we can revisit it, because if that interpretation was done by somebody in the past who didn't have access to the knowledge, scientific discoveries we have today, then we can go back and and engage and try to understand the verses within this new light to remove that contradiction, right? And I call that such efforts should not be done by scientists alone or theologians alone. It should always be teams. In the past, knowledge was enough. It wasn't that much, so one person could have the capacity to cover all the different types of sciences, and that's why we had Renaissance scientists who would be philosophers and at the same time medical physicians and the chemists and so on. Now science is too much. One person can't have it all.
Yeah.
So we need these teams where we sit together from different disciplines, respectfully listen to each other, engage while working towards a common goal. That how can we help humanity? Because that's why we're here, right? And as a Muslim, that's our calling. We are on earth to make a life better, not just for humans, for earth, for every living organism to live in harmony. So we have a responsibility towards our earth, towards the globe, to maintain it and keep it in harmony for future generations.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something that's really important, especially today, just around the world in general, trying to, keep science education something that's public for people, where scientists are actively communicating with people. Because I think that's where you get this big divide, is when scientists kind of, shelter themselves off from the rest of society. And they're like, well, I'm the expert, you should listen to me. Well, people want to have more personal interactions so they can understand, these complex concepts. And, just throwing out scientific facts that doesn't necessarily register with people. So being, scientists communicating, their research, I think does make a huge difference for society and in general, just the education of society when it comes to science. So.
Oh, I agree. I think scientists need to practice and be trained and learn the tools and the skills of communication and storytelling.
Yeah.
As humans, we evolved to be storytellers. That's how we survived. We learn through storytelling. So scientists need to, hone those skills. At least a good amount of scientists should do that to build those bridges of understanding and to get young people curious and excited about science as well.
Yeah, definitely. So I'm curious then, thinking a little bit more, what are you currently researching right now? What are you currently working on?
So I do two fields of research. One is I study ethnic populations. We have two populations in Jordan that were from southern Russia. So we have the Circassians, who are from the Caucasus Mountains of southern Russia, and Chechens, who come from Chechnya, that recently became independent from Russia. So those two, 150 years ago, they were forced to leave their countries because they were persecuted for their religion as Muslims. So they fled south. So some settled in what today is Turkey, Syria, Jordan, Palestine. Even they've fled to as far as New Jersey. There's a big population in New Jersey and in the U.S. So when I finished my PhD and wanted to establish my own field, I made my observations and realized that nobody had studied these two populations. And so we became the world experts, documenting them from an anthropology point of view, epidemiology, and then genetics. And we have a DNA database. And we discovered a novel gene risk factor for diabetes in these populations that has, helped us understand better how diabetes develops. It's adding to the puzzle. Diabetes is a complex disease, and because they are a unique genetic pool, because they didn't intermarry with other populations, and they come from an ancient lineage from the human lineage tree, we were able to discover that gene. And then people from other labs around the world wanted to work with us to compare the modern day DNA of these two populations with ancient DNA, like 11,000 years ago. And through that comparison, we were able to discover, like, when horses were domesticated, did farmers immigrate from Europe to Asia, or the other way around? Hepatitis, when did that evolve? How many thousand years ago? Because they used to think it was just a very recent virus, but it turned out we found it's like at least 4,000 years old. So all these discoveries came out of that part of our research. The second part, also stemming from observation, is I studied the impact of trauma on epigenetics. So epigenetics is another new field of research, which is how does the environment change how our DNA is expressed. So with all the waves of refugees that have come into Jordan, where I live, and my father being who was born in Jerusalem, was a refugee in 1948 when the Zionist forces took over Jerusalem. And my mother is from Aleppo, from Syria, with
Oh,
all the
wow.
waves of the Syrian refugees. So being in Jordan and seeing all these waves of refugees piqued my curiosity to ask, how does trauma not just impact behavior or biology, like we looked at how cortisol as a hormone of stress goes up and how can we reduce it, but I wanted to look at the impact of war and trauma, displacement on epigenetics, and whether that is transmitted across generations, like to grandchildren. And I also not just wanted to understand that, I also wanted to flip the question: why should we always use a negative lens? Like, how does trauma impact us negatively? We've evolved, we've survived multiple, let's say, wars and strifes throughout the human evolution, but we have thrived. So can we flip it and ask, how have we been resilient? Can we look for the positive, the silver lining of all of this? Not that I'm celebrating war or
Right.
displacement, that should stop. But we have survived. Can we understand that? Everything is media sensational. They love to look at negative stereotypes. But I wanted to flip it and be positive and look at how resilience remains and stays and goes forward. So that's my research now, and we're very excited because this is cutting edge.
Yeah, that's super cool. Yeah, I mean, yeah, population genetics and stuff, that is a really fascinating field. And there's so much we're learning and so much we're going to continue to learn from studying populations and their migrations over time and all the causes of it. Yeah, that's very cool. And what would you say is the best way for people to keep track of your work and follow what you're doing?
Everything is usually, I have a website, which is, if they just Google my name, it's on Harvard, because I was a visiting professor there and a scholar at the Radcliffe Institute. So I have a Harvard website. But also, just if people go to PubMed, this is more scientific, and just put my name, Rana Dajani, they can see all the scientific publications. And I write profusely for the general public, to your call that scientists should communicate better.
Yeah.
So I write a lot of world view columns in Nature that is trying to simplify the science around. And actually, we just aired a TV science show on Muslim Network.
Wow.
So I interview scientists from all over the US to share with us how they got interested in science. And we can send you the link to that to share.
Cool. Okay. Yeah, that's really interesting. And are you on social media as well, for if people want to follow you there? Or?
Oh yeah. So I have Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn.
Perfect. Okay.
And usually it's Professor Rana Dajani. And I'm sure they can find me.
Yeah, awesome.
I can share those links with you as well.
Yeah, no problem. Perfect. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on and sharing all this information. Really fascinating. And yeah, really appreciate it. So
thank you for your podcast and for allowing this space for people to listen to different opinions and to engage in dialogue, because that's the only way we can learn and grow.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the goal. I mean, that's how we all can come together and make a better world. So